In our week 4 assignment, we'll be painting an ocean seascape as viewed from on the beach. And our inspiration will be this image here. We won't be copying this exactly, but it'll be a similar layout where there will be beach, water, and then rocks, cliffs. So we'll go back and look at some of our other examples here. We've got a nice, just basic beach. What's good about this one is there's a lot of detail in the sand, lots of footprints. This is a view from Seattle, and it's a very windy day in this particular composition, so there's a lot of movement and waves in the water. You can see the nice mountains in the background. This is an example of some splash. When waves splash into an object, you get this kind of effect here where all the water's kind of globbed together. And we have another example of that here. This is a good example of just a basic beach with nice aquamarine water. The water we're going to do in our painting is going to be a little bit darker, but this gives you an idea of how you could do other colors of water. Another similar example, this piece has a really nice perspective point that goes off to the right. And it's nice to put all of your objects kind of in perspective and not just do everything kind of flat across horizontally. Like this example here, although it looks nice and realistic, it's kind of a boring composition because everything's just straight across. This is a nice example of sea foam as it comes up on the shore. There's lots of little details there. And here's a good example of a shoreline that's at an angle going off in perspective. This is how we're going to kind of do our seascape when we paint it. Here's a really good example of a curling wave, and this will be helpful in examining how to paint that. Here's a good example of a rock, a really nice weathered rock that's up near the shoreline. We'll be painting some rocks kind of like this. And you can see how the sea foam kind of floats around the rock at the base of it. Now let's look a little more in depth at each of these ocean components. Oceans vary in form and color depending on location, time of day, weather, and water depth. An ocean is both a 2D plane and a 3D form. Its surface distorts as movement in the water increases. A rough ocean will have a lot of distortion and three-dimensionality. A more placid ocean will have little disturbance until the water interacts with the shoreline. Use a strong contrast of light and dark colors to give the surface the appearance of movement. You can see in these 3 examples here, we have this rather calm ocean here with just a little bit of movement. It doesn't start to get rough until we get to the shoreline here. And in the one to the right of it, it's a little more rough. There's a lot of these waves kind of going on back here. You can see a lot more movement going on with these little waves in the background. And then especially on the shoreline here, there's a lot of movement, a lot of contrast. And in this top example, there's a big wave, which has a lot of movement. So there's a lot of contrast. There's this really dark area here, which is where the light's kind of getting blocked. Let's say the light in this case is kind of coming from the top left. You have this nice dark area up against this nice light area here. And that creates contrast. When you see it from far away, it looks kind of like these examples here. And there's even less contrast here because there's only these slight areas where there's lighter and darker colors, but there isn't really a whole lot of big white chunks of waves going on in this piece because the water's a little more calm. A sense of perspective can greatly enhance your composition. Don't have everything line up horizontal and straight. Make sure your ocean components flow towards a vanishing point by angling the waves and shoreline. Your horizon, however, should remain perfectly straight. So in this top left example, our horizon is straight across here, and our perspective point starts over in the corner on the right and ends on the left. And you can see everything kind of follows that perspective point. This dark area in the water. Everything kind of flows towards that point. It's not just straight across. That makes it look a lot more interesting. In the bottom example, we have the same thing. We have this perspective that kind of goes off towards the left. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to use the perspective guides, especially when you're up this close. All you really have to do is just kind of make everything go diagonal rather than straight across. When you paint your shoreline and your waves, and when you get into the distance, everything will be pretty flat, pretty horizontal, but when you start to get a little bit closer, it kind of all starts to go into this perspective. Because the surface of the water is reflective, the sky is often incorporated into the color of the water. The reflection gets distorted as the movement in water increases. Now, you can kind of see in these two examples here, if you look really closely, there's the sky color on this bottom example. It's incorporated kind of around here on the water. You can really see it in just little patches here and there. The water isn't all just one flat aquamarine color like this. So that sky color is in there. It's also incorporated into the foam, in the shadow areas of the foam, and kind of incorporated into the sand color and everything else. So you want to use that to make your water look more reflective. You can also see it here. We have our sky color in our top left, and you can especially see it on this dark area where there's this reef or whatever this is underwater. The sky color is really hitting there and reflecting. It's also very present in this foam here that's off in the shadow and in the shadows of the trees. When there's movement in the water, waves are created. Waves interact with each other as well as objects that they come into contact with. Most often, waves interact with the ocean floor, which makes the water more shallow as it approaches the shoreline. This interaction often has a dramatic effect of making the waves break or splash as they near the beach. So in this example I have here from Seattle, there's a lot of waves that are being created and broken by the wind. The wind is kind of blowing this way and really causing these background waves. But as you near the foreground here, there is this kind of wave break happening here that you can see because the waves are impacting the shoreline. You can see there's kind of some splash going on down here. So anytime that the water kind of has movement or runs into something, you're going to want to add these white areas of foam. Waves are made of two primary components, the contour of the wave shape and the splash created near the edge of the wave. The contour is the shape of the wave, and it's typically influenced by the color of the water mixed with other colors to make the water look more transparent. As the wave curls, the water becomes thinner and more translucent, as you can see here. It's nice to use yellow and green colors to add flavor to your waves. So you can really see there's this nice curling happening. The water is contouring, and this contour is creating shadow areas and highlight areas. The highlights up here on the top side where the light is, and the shadows down here where the light isn't reaching because it's getting covered up by this wave that's curling over. Now the second component, the splash, which is this splashing water here on the edge of the wave, this nice white area. This is the white spray, and it's caused by the wave breaking. It's most prominent when a big wave crashes into an object. The color is very light, almost white, and its shadows are influenced by the sky and the ocean colors to give it form. So you can see all this blue that's incorporated in there. All this blue is from the sky color and the water color reflected into it, and it gives it a lot of three-dimensionality. If we just used white in these areas and we didn't add this nice shadow color, it wouldn't quite look like foam. So you really have to put that in there for the white of the foam to stand out. Your splashes need to have a lot of character. They need to look like they have movement and they flow in a general direction that follows the contour of the wave. So we have our wave that's contouring going this way, our water's going this way, and our splash is kind of going in that same direction. Here and there it's kind of splashing up, and then maybe the wind is carrying some of the particles away. So there's a lot of movement in this water. You can see these splashes are going this way, and this splash is kind of flipping upwards. There's a whole lot going on here. It makes it look really interesting. When waves overlap the shoreline, they become almost fully transparent, and the color of the beach begins to gradually show through. During this transition, you may want to add some green color to further enhance the effect of translucent water. White highlights begin to appear as the water gets more reflective. Give your shoreline a sense of perspective by putting it at an angle, rather than straight across horizontal. So this shoreline here has a little bit of angle, and you can see that the water is kind of this deep blue, and then as it gets to right about here where the water gets more shallow, this is where it starts to kind of mix in with some of this sand color here, and they start to mix together, and the water gets a little more translucent because there's this wave that's kind of starting to curl up here, and you can kind of see through the water a little bit more. And then when we get really close, the water is even more translucent, and then you really just start to see more of this brown with a little bit of reflections of the sky over it here. And then, of course, there's this kind of area here where the sand is just kind of damp, which is really just kind of a darker sand color. And then where the sand is dry, around here, there really isn't any of the watercolor. It's pretty much just the sand and rocks at this point. As the tide goes in and out, you'll find sea foam on the leading edge of the water. This foam is a collection of debris and tiny bubbles, which is a very light, almost white color. Use the sky, ocean, and beach colors when adding shadows to your foam. As with your splashes, your foam will greatly benefit from form and character. Bubbles create a lot of elliptical-shaped, positive and negative space. The bubbles are concentrated near the leading edge of the foam and taper off as the foam recedes. So in this example here, you can see there's a lot of these little circular holes that are poked in this foam. And it's a very almost kind of specific pattern. And this kind of happens when these bubbles pop in the foam. I'm sure it happens for other reasons too. The sky color, which is this kind of blue-gray, green-gray color, is incorporated in the water. So there's kind of a monochromatic scheme here, but you can see in the foam, there is a lot of that color where the foam kind of has shadows in little areas. So you really want to add in a lot of the sky color and watercolor to that. There's some of the sand color here incorporated in this foam. Maybe because it's picking up some sand, maybe because it's reflecting sand, who knows. And you can see it as the foam recedes. There's kind of this leading edge here where the foam is really concentrated, and then it starts to kind of taper off. There's kind of another little leading edge here where there's a lot of foam, and then it starts to kind of taper off, and then another kind of area where the wave is kind of breaking. And there's these different separations of the foam. Now, you don't really have to get this technical about it, because in our painting we're not going to be looking at the foam this close, but you want to try to give your shoreline a sense of there being this foam and this action going on here to give it more character. There's also some foam on these background waves here that you can see that kind of trails off of them. And these are waves that are just kind of breaking out more into the water. From a distance, sand appears to have one general color, though up close it's often made from rocks and debris of varying colors. It's up to you as the artist to decide which colors to use and how much to vary them. Sand is typically shades of brown, gray, red, and white. Where the sand meets the water, it may darken a bit as it absorbs the water. As the tide recedes, white highlights will make the dry sand look more reflective. Sand needs a sense of contour and depth. Use contrast to make the sand surface lumpy. You can see that lumpiness in all of these examples, especially this top left one here with all the footprints and the tire tracks. This really helps to make your beach look like people have been on it and walking around. There's some more gravelly beaches like these top right examples where it's mostly pebbles and things. And then down in the bottom, there's a beach with a lot of sand and a lot of character. There's a lot of debris, all kinds of different things all strung out along the beach. Your sand needs a sense of coarse texture. This can be accomplished by adding a layer of fine texture on top of the sand surface. Observe how the sand texture is in perspective and gets larger near the foreground. Like in this example here, these rocks are much bigger than the rocks that you see in the background. Now there are some big rocks in the background, but overall the general scale of the rocks is in perspective. It gets bigger and then it gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller into the distance here as we go back. It's the same thing with the footprints in the sand here. These footprints are bigger than the footprints that are in the background, which are squished and in perspective. As with the sand, larger pebbles, stones, and debris will all vary in color and size. Maintain the sense of perspective by making the details larger in the foreground, and give the shapes a bearing and a direction that flows with the perspective point. So these rocks, they're a little bit squished and kind of flat. They're these kind of flat elliptical shapes mostly. Sometimes the rocks are turned at an angle, but for the most part, they maintain the sense of perspective. If you don't maintain that and you do all your rocks completely round, they're not going to look right because they're going to appear to be at an overhead angle. In this particular perspective point, the vanishing point is pretty central. I don't know exactly where it is here, but it's somewhere in the center, and everything follows that point. You can see it in the cliffs, and you can see it in the clouds. You can't see it in the rocks unless you look very closely. But let's say that this is our perspective point. These rocks here are kind of flowing this way, and they all kind of work in this perspective point here. As you start to get over here, they kind of start to turn. So there's some different tricks we can do to get that effect. But you'll also notice that, again, the pebbles and rocks also get smaller as they go into the foreground. And there's also kind of a tapering off where near the shoreline, it's generally more sand and finer little bits of rocks. And then as you get closer to the land, the size of the pebbles gets bigger. Adding cliffs can help establish a sense of scale and distance in your ocean. The details will be smaller and the color more simplified on faraway cliffs. The shadow color can be lightened or darkened to show distance. Use overlapping layers of cliffs to give your painting depth. Separate the cliffs from the water surface by adding a water line. The cliff colors should be reflected into the water as well. You can see that here. There's a little bit of this dark reflection from the cliffs going on in the water, and it gets kind of broken up by the waves. For rocks and cliffs that are closer to the observer, you may add more obvious detail. Use a lot of texture and vary the color of the rock to add character. This is an ideal point to add crashing waves that impact the rocks. This will add a lot of visual interest and realism to your painting. Now, we don't have any crashing waves on this foreground rock, but you can see some in this background rock here. There's this wave here slamming against it from the back side. We could do that here. We could have a big wave splashing here if we wanted to. Now that we have some observations to draw upon, we're ready to start our final assignment for week 4, painting an ocean seascape.